The heat came first. It wasn't the kind of heat you could shake off with a cold drink or a breeze through the cornfields. No, this was different. It was thick, like a blanket draped across the valley, the air heavy with the smell of pine sap and something darker, something burning. Then came the smoke. Thick, gray ribbons began to curl over the distant ridge, crawling across the blue sky like a slow-moving snake. In the town of Pine Valley, nestled between the foothills of the Appalachians and the wide stretches of farmland, the wildfire was still miles away. But everyone in town knew, fire didn't travel politely. It didn't knock. It barged in and took everything. "Son," his father said, squinting toward the horizon, "you feel that?" Eli Turner nodded, his eyes fixed on the mountains. "Yeah, Pa. I feel it." It was the beginning of August, and the sun hadn't let up in over 3 weeks. Rain hadn't touched the red dirt in nearly 2 months. The crops were already failing, and the cows were drinking from troughs that hadn't been full since May. Farmers were worried. Fire chiefs were worried. But what could they do? Eli wiped sweat from his brow and stood on the edge of the old barn, where their family had stored hay since his grandpa was a boy. He was 17, skinny but wiry from work, and known around school as the quiet kid who could fix anything. Most didn't notice him. Those who did thought he was just a farmer's son, good with his hands but not much else. But that was about to change. That night, after dinner, the Turner family sat in silence around their chipped kitchen table. Eli's little sister, Grace, picked at her potatoes while their mother read the emergency alert from her old iPhone. "Mandatory evacuation in the northern zone," she whispered. "That's just 20 miles from here." Their father leaned back in his chair, his face like worn leather, creased and sun-toughened. "If it jumps the ridge, we won't have time to pack." Eli looked up. "So what do we do?" There was a long pause. "We pray," his mother said, her voice shaking. "And we prepare." Later that night, Eli couldn't sleep. He sat by the window in his upstairs bedroom, looking out at the barn and the dry fields beyond. The moonlight shimmered off the tin roof, and the stars above looked dimmer than usual. Maybe it was the smoke. Maybe it was fear. And then he remembered something. Back when he was 12, he'd built a homemade irrigation system for their garden, rerouting the runoff from the well pipe to water the tomatoes. His dad had laughed at first, said it was just a waste of time, but when the vegetables doubled in size that year, he stopped laughing. Eli stood up slowly. What if there was a way to stop the fire before it reached the valley? It sounded impossible. It was impossible. He was just a kid. No one in town took him seriously. But as he scribbled notes into his sketchbook and pulled out an old schematic he once drew for a school science project, something inside him started to burn, not fear this time, but an idea. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next morning, Eli was up before the sun. He didn't tell anyone at breakfast what he was planning. Instead, he grabbed his backpack, stuffed it with tools, a portable battery, and a roll of old copper wire. He slung a small blueprint tube under his arm and headed out the door before his mother could ask where he was going. He biked past the church, the general store, and the shuttered high school gym. Smoke already lingered over the town like fog, and his phone buzzed with a new emergency update. Fire advancing toward ridge. Winds shifting. Be prepared to evacuate. But Eli wasn't running. He pedaled harder. His destination was the old water station at the edge of the forest preserve, an abandoned structure from the 1960s that had once supplied irrigation to a long-gone orchard. Most kids didn't even know it existed. But Eli had found it years ago during one of his long hikes through the woods. It was rusted and half swallowed by vines, but the pipes were still intact. The tank, if he remembered correctly, could still hold water. If he could reroute it. If he could build a pressure valve to force the water down the slope. If he could trigger the release remotely with his phone or a solar sensor. Too many ifs, he muttered to himself. But no one else is trying anything. As he climbed over the chain-link fence, his heart beat faster, not just from effort, but from the realization that this might actually work. It would take everything he had, and probably more. But maybe, just maybe, it could create a wet barrier around the ridge. Enough to slow the fire. Maybe even stop it. Back in town, people were loading up their trucks, grabbing photo albums, locking doors that might never open again. On Main Street, Sheriff Harlan was setting up a roadblock. Pastor Jim was organizing a shelter in the church basement. And on the far edge of town, the Turner family stood staring at the smoke rolling in. "Where's Eli?" Grace asked. Her mother looked around, suddenly anxious. "He said he was going to check the fence." But Eli wasn't at the fence. He was building something the town had never seen before. Most people in Pine Valley didn't remember Eli Turner's name. At school, he was that kid who sits near the window, or the one always scribbling in his notebook. Some thought he was weird. Others thought he was just shy. But nobody ever thought much more than that. He didn't play football like the other boys. He didn't go to dances. He didn't care about sneakers or popularity or who was dating who. Eli cared about wires, engines, and water pressure. He read science journals while the other kids watched TikToks. He once built a windmill out of scrap parts just to charge his phone, and no one at school believed it worked until a storm knocked out the power and his was the only phone that stayed on. But still, they laughed. They laughed when he wore his hand-me-down boots. They laughed when he brought his lunch in a reused bread bag. They laughed when he gave a presentation in science class about how to make wildfire-resistant farming communities. "Who cares?" one boy had shouted from the back of the room. "We live in the middle of nowhere, not California." Even the teacher, Mr. Haskins, had chuckled. "Interesting theory, Eli. But let's focus on practical science, okay?" That day, Eli went home and threw the project in the trash. He told himself it didn't matter. He wasn't doing it for praise. He liked figuring things out, how to make something from nothing. But deep down, the rejection stuck with him, like a burr in his sock. It reminded him that no matter how hard he worked, no one saw what he saw. Not until the fire. Back at the old water station, Eli worked with his hands like they were moving on instinct. He had stripped back the overgrown weeds, pried open the rusted control box, and found the mainline valve, miraculously still intact. The tank could hold thousands of gallons if it still worked. And if he could connect the line to a makeshift spray grid, he might just be able to create a perimeter of damp earth across the slope. He checked the satellite map on his phone, only 15% signal, but enough. The fire had jumped containment 5 miles east of the ridge. That meant he had hours, maybe, before it reached the edge of town. The clock was ticking. He pulled out a coil of copper wire, some tubing, and the small solar sensor he'd salvaged from a broken lawn light. Every move felt fueled by something deeper than adrenaline. It was purpose. For once in his life, Eli Turner knew what he was doing mattered. And he wasn't going to let them laugh this time. Back in town, Principal Dorsey stood outside the school gym directing traffic. The evacuation alert had now extended to Pine Valley proper. Parents were rushing to grab their kids. The fire was coming faster than expected, and the wind was no longer predictable. "Where's Eli Turner?" a voice asked suddenly. It was Marcy Hall, the smartest girl in class, captain of the debate team, and the only one who'd ever once told Eli, "Your project was actually kind of genius." Now, she looked panicked. "Anyone seen Eli?" she asked again. "He probably ran off," someone muttered. "That weirdo's always out in the woods." But Marcy's gut said different. She remembered the day he showed her the wildfire diagram in 8th grade. He'd explained it so clearly, how flames jumped tree canopies, how embers could travel over a mile, how the key to stopping it wasn't just water but timing, pressure, direction. And she remembered something else. He had said, one day, it might save this town. Marcy turned and ran for her bike. At the ridge, Eli twisted the final pipe into place and secured it with a clamp. He'd built a crude pressure release mechanism using an old gear system and a lever trigger that could activate with solar heat. It was primitive, but if the fire reached the sensor, the sun's heat would cause the spring-loaded release to snap, opening the valve. Water would surge through the pipe grid and spray out in a wide arc, if the tank still held enough pressure. If. He looked down at the valley, his valley. It was dry, cracked, and ready to burn. But it was his home. He set the sensor into place, double-checked the wiring, and took a long breath. The system was ready. All that was left now was hope. Then he heard a voice. Eli. He turned around. Marcy stood at the top of the hill, her chest heaving, her eyes wide. What are you doing? He didn't smile. He didn't explain. He simply said, trying to buy us time. She looked past him at the rigged-up water tank, the pipes, the sensor, her mouth falling open. You built this? He nodded. And it'll work? I don't know, Eli said. But it's better than nothing. Marcy stared at him, something like awe in her eyes. You're not who I thought you were. Eli met her gaze, his voice low. No one ever does. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind picking up, bringing with it the acrid scent of burning trees. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed. Come on, Eli said, grabbing his bag. We have to warn the town. Marcy followed, glancing back at the contraption one more time. You're crazy, Turner. Yeah, he said. But I might be right. As they rode back into town, smoke now smeared the sky like a dirty bruise. Fire crews were arriving. Helicopters beat overhead. The church bell was ringing, an old emergency signal. The kind folks hoped they'd never have to use. Eli jumped off his bike and ran to the sheriff. I built something, he said. A system to stop the fire at the ridge. Sheriff Harlan blinked at him. What are you talking about, son? Marcy stepped up. He's not lying. It's real. He's built a water perimeter. We don't have time to argue. Eli held out the blueprint. The sheriff scanned it, his eyes narrowing. And then he said the words Eli had waited his whole life to hear. Show me. By the time Sheriff Harlan and two fire officials reached the ridge, the sky looked like a war zone. Smoke boiled over the distant treetops. The sun, now an eerie blood-orange disk, was barely visible through the haze. And there, standing beside his makeshift irrigation system, was the quiet farm boy no one ever thought twice about. This your rig, son? One of the firefighters asked, squinting through the smoke. Eli nodded. I call it a pressure-activated perimeter. It uses an old water tank, solar sensors, and a gravity-fed pipe system to create a firebreak. The second fireman raised a skeptical brow. You're telling me this contraption is supposed to stop a wildfire? No, Eli said simply. But it'll slow it. Maybe long enough for you to create a proper line behind it. The sheriff handed the blueprints to the older firefighter, Captain Roscoe Delaney, a grizzled veteran of dozens of fire seasons. Roscoe studied the hand-drawn sketches, then looked back at the rig. He traced the layout with his eyes, the solar-triggered valve, the trench path, the angled nozzles aimed downslope. You did this all by yourself? Roscoe asked. Yes, sir, Eli said, his voice steady. And I've been testing smaller versions on our farm for over a year. Roscoe looked back down at the drawing. It's crude. But the science checks out. Crude, muttered the younger firefighter. It looks like something out of MacGyver. Crude doesn't mean stupid, Roscoe shot back. It means resourceful. For the first time in his life, Eli didn't feel embarrassed to be different. Back in town, Principal Dorsey stood in front of the student body, barking orders to teachers, directing students into groups, organizing transportation. The gym had been converted into an emergency shelter. Bottled water and medical kits were being stacked on tables. Parents were arriving in droves, and panicked whispers echoed off the walls. And then, the announcement came. Attention, we have a possible perimeter defense system in place at the ridge. Local student Eli Turner designed it. Fire officials are currently testing its viability. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Someone scoffed. Eli. That Eli. Marcy, standing near the front, folded her arms. Yeah. That Eli. A few students started whispering. A football player nudged his buddy. Wait, is that why the sheriff left with him? Guess so. And just like that, the snickering stopped. Back on the ridge, Captain Roscoe signaled his team. Prep the backfire trench and line up our rigs. If this boy's invention holds up, it could give us a fighting chance. He turned to Eli. What's the trigger? That solar sensor, Eli said, pointing. When it heats past 140 degrees Fahrenheit, it'll snap the tension spring and open the main valve. How long till it hits that temperature? Eli checked the slope. With the wind the way it is, maybe 30 minutes. Roscoe looked at his team. Then we move fast. As the men set to work, Eli stood beside Marcy, watching his contraption like a parent watching their child take its first steps. Never thought I'd see the day, Marcy said quietly. What day? He asked. The day people stopped laughing at you. Eli didn't respond. Not because he didn't care. But because, in that moment, he didn't care if people laughed. He only cared if it worked. 10 miles east, the fire moved like a living beast, gnashing through trees, devouring brush, belching smoke so thick it swallowed sound. The helicopters overhead were now dropping retardant, zigzagging over the tree line like angry hornets. Captain Roscoe's voice came through on the emergency scanner. All units, prepare for contact in T-10 minutes. Eli's heart pounded. Every second felt like a lifetime. His clothes were drenched in sweat, partly from the heat, partly from nerves. If the solar spring failed, the whole setup would be worthless. If the pressure valve leaked, if the main pipe burst. He forced the thoughts away. This was his moment. Then, just as the first wave of heat shimmered across the valley, it happened. Click. The spring snapped. There was a loud whump as the valve burst open, and a sudden jet of water blasted from the pipe grid. Like a snake coming to life, the rig hissed and roared, spraying water across the dry ridge with shocking force. Eli couldn't believe it. It's working. Marcy screamed over the roar. Roscoe radioed in, initiate phase 2. Use the spray zone as the primary buffer. Firefighters moved quickly. They dug trenches behind the wet zone, reinforcing it with dirt mounds. The water was soaking into the ground, dampening the brush just enough to slow the advance. And then the fire reached the edge. Flames licked the ridge, and stopped. Steam rose where the fire hit the wet soil. It sizzled. It smoked. But it didn't pass. Eli stared in disbelief. The line held. Turner. Roscoe shouted. You crazy little genius, it's holding. Down in town, the scanner crackled through the speakers inside the gym. Everyone heard the update. Perimeter is holding. Repeat, perimeter is holding. Water grid from student Eli Turner is operational and slowing the fire. There was silence. Then gasps. Then applause. Even Principal Dorsey looked stunned. He turned to one of the teachers. I thought that boy was always just doodling nonsense in his notebook. The teacher nodded slowly. Apparently not. And in that moment, Eli Turner's name was no longer a punchline. It was a lifeline. As the fire was finally rerouted and the threat lessened, firefighters and residents slowly returned from the ridge. The air was still thick, the sky still bruised, but the town was safe. Eli sat on the back of a fire truck, covered in ash, his hands scraped and blistered. Roscoe handed him a bottle of water. "I've seen MIT grads with half your sense. You ever think about applying to an engineering school?" Eli smiled faintly. "Never really thought I could." "Well," Roscoe said, "you might want to start." From across the street, Marcy waved. This time, people noticed. And nobody laughed. By the next morning, the small town of Pine Hollow had turned into a media circus. News vans were parked up and down Main Street. Reporters with perfect hair and polished shoes stood in front of the scorched ridge, gesturing dramatically for their live feeds. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing aerial footage of the firebreak that had stopped the blaze. And at the center of it all stood Eli Turner, the quiet boy from a humble farm, now dubbed the teen who outsmarted the wildfire. He didn't know where to look. The cameras, the microphones, the strangers shouting his name, it was all too much. He hadn't slept. His clothes still smelled like smoke. His hands were sore from working through the night. But somehow, everyone wanted a piece of him. "Eli. Channel 7 News, can we get a quick word?" "Eli, how did you come up with this invention?" "Eli, what do you want to say to other kids who feel invisible like you did?" The attention made him squirm. Marcy stood close, acting as a makeshift bodyguard. "Back off, people. He's not some celebrity, he's a kid who saved our town." A tall reporter with a manicured beard stepped forward. "Actually, he's a national hero. The state fire chief confirmed this morning that Eli's invention bought critical time for containment teams. He may have saved hundreds of lives." Eli stared at the ground. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired. Across town, Principal Dorsey watched the news from his office, jaw clenched. His school, his pride and joy, had been thrust into the spotlight, not because of grades or sports trophies, but because of Eli Turner. The same student he'd barely acknowledged. The same one he'd once threatened with detention for not engaging in group work. "Unbelievable," Dorsey muttered. "He built a contraption in a shed, and now he's the golden boy." But deep down, it wasn't disbelief. It was something else. Something darker. Resentment. For all the grants and programs the school had begged for, Eli had done what none of them had. And Dorsey hated that he hadn't seen it coming. He opened his laptop and began composing an email to the district superintendent, with one goal, to make himself part of the story. Meanwhile, back at the Turner farm, Eli sat on the porch beside his father, who looked like he hadn't smiled that big in years. "You made us proud, son," his father said, rubbing his calloused hands together. "You really did." Eli nodded slowly. "I didn't think it'd go this far. I just wanted to help." "That's how most great things start," his father replied. A beat passed. Then Eli asked, Do you think this will change anything? For us? For the farm?" His dad looked out toward the fields, where ash now dusted the crops. "Maybe. Maybe not. But no matter what happens, you showed people who you are. That kind of change sticks." Just then, a car pulled up. Out stepped a sharply dressed woman with a leather briefcase. "Eli Turner," she called out. "My name's Jessica Klein. I represent the State Science and Innovation Foundation. We'd like to talk." Eli blinked. "About what?" "About scholarships. Funding. Maybe even a patent." Inside the local diner, a different conversation was brewing. 3 boys from the football team huddled around a booth, staring at their phones. One of them, Tyler, was the same guy who had once poured chocolate milk on Eli's homework. "Can you believe this?" he muttered. "The dude was literally a ghost last week. Now he's trending on Twitter. He's got over 200,000 followers already," another boy said. Someone made a fan page. "They're calling him Backfire Boy." Tyler slammed his hand on the table. "It should have been one of us. We're the ones people should be talking about." The third boy snorted. "Yeah. You invent any fire-saving gadgets lately?" Tyler shoved his chair back and stood. "I don't care. That farm freak isn't better than us. Just got lucky." But in his heart, he knew it wasn't luck. It was brilliance. Back at school, the teachers tried to regain some semblance of normalcy. But how could they? Reporters kept calling. The science wing was overrun with people asking to see Eli's old projects. Someone had even installed a new bulletin board labeled, "The Genius Among Us." In English class, Ms. Goodwin handed back essays. As she reached Eli, she gave him a shy smile. "Yours was excellent, as always." He looked down. A red A+ marked the top of the page, followed by a sticky note, "You have a gift. Never stop using it." Eli didn't say anything. But inside, he felt something click. Not just pride, but possibility. That afternoon, a black SUV pulled up to the school. Out stepped a man in a government-issued suit. He had a badge, a tablet, and questions. He met with Principal Dorsey first. "Mr. Dorsey," the man said, "we've been authorized to award young Mr. Turner with a state innovation grant." Dorsey smiled through gritted teeth. "Yes, well, we're very proud of Eli. He's always been unique." The agent looked unconvinced. "We'd also like to interview a few teachers. Confirm the nature of his support system here." Dorsey cleared his throat. "Of course. I personally encouraged his development every step of the way." Which, of course, was a lie. That evening, Eli and Marcy sat on the ridge where it all began. The fire was long gone now, just scorched earth and blackened trunks left behind. But the wind was soft. Peaceful. Marcy turned to him. "So, what now? You gonna be famous forever?" He chuckled. "I hope not." She smirked. "I don't think you get to decide. You saved a town, Eli. You kinda broke the internet." He looked down at his hands. "I didn't do it for the internet." "I know." A pause. Then she added, "For what it's worth. I always knew there was something different about you. Something good." He looked at her. For the first time in forever, he felt seen. Not pitted. Not mocked. Seen. But not everyone wanted to celebrate. Somewhere across town, a shadow moved through a dark office. Fingers clicked on a keyboard. A file was opened. Subject, Eli Turner. Lines of text appeared. Disciplinary record. Grades. Behavior notes. One line in red, shows signs of obsessive focus, possible delusions of grandeur. The file was copied. And sent. To someone who very much wanted Eli Turner to fail. It started with a whisper. Just a few words murmured in a hallway. A passing comment in the locker room. A side-eyed remark in the cafeteria. "He didn't really build it by himself, you know. I heard his dad helped him and he's just taking the credit. Maybe he just got lucky. I mean, how could someone like him come up with all that?" Eli noticed it, at first, as just tension. A shift in how people looked at him. Some smiled bigger than usual, with wide, almost plastic grins. Others wouldn't meet his eyes at all. A few turned silent when he walked into a room. Then the online post started. First it was an anonymous Reddit thread, "Teen Wildfire Heroes design suspiciously similar to existing patents. Coincidence? Then a TikTok video, is Eli Turner a genius or just good at stealing ideas? Within 2 days, the whispers had become a wave. In Principal Dorsey's office, the phone rang again. It was the superintendent. Again. Yes, we're still supporting Eli, Dorsey said into the receiver, pacing the floor. Of course. But there are emerging concerns. He paused. Academic integrity concerns. He said the words slowly, as if testing them. The truth was, he hadn't found anything. But the whispers had given him a way back into the spotlight. If he couldn't ride Eli's success, maybe he could control the narrative. He called in Mr. Feldman, the science teacher. Has Eli ever shown signs of cutting corners? Dorsey asked. Feldman blinked. Cutting corners? No. If anything, he works harder than anyone else. Dorsey said. And where did he learn such advanced techniques? Did you teach them? Feldman straightened. No. He taught me a few things, actually. Dorsey waved his hand. Never mind. Dismissed. Meanwhile, Eli sat in the school library, staring at a laptop screen. The video was grainy, obviously edited, but it had over 100,000 views already. A smug voice narrated. Sure, he looks like a hero. But if you compare Eli Turner's design to a 1997 emergency burnback barrier used in Montana, you'll see striking similarities. Coincidence? Or just good Googling? Eli felt his stomach twist. He'd spent 3 years building and refining his system, burn sensors, wind deflection algorithms, a custom soil cooling agent, but now, people were acting like he'd copied it from Wikipedia. He closed the laptop. It's not true, he whispered. But would anyone care? Marcy was furious. She stormed into the guidance counselor's office that afternoon, arms crossed, voice tight with rage. You've seen what they're saying online, right? Are you guys just gonna sit there and let him get torn apart? Mrs. Garland, the counselor, looked up from her desk, surprised. Marcy, we don't control what people say on the internet. No, but you can control what happens here, she snapped. Eli needs support. Not rumors. Not cowardly silence. Garland sighed. I've talked to the faculty. Some believe the pressure might be too much for him. Fame at his age can be destabilizing. Marcy stared at her. So you're saying he's the problem? Not the liars? Garland hesitated. Sometimes, when people rise too quickly, others want to see them fall. Marcy's voice dropped. Then maybe it's your job to stop the fall. That night, Eli sat in the barn. Not building. Not sketching. Just, sitting. The old workbench looked foreign now, like it belonged to someone else. Someone confident. Someone not afraid. He could hear his father in the house, talking on the phone. Another call from someone in Washington. Maybe a TV appearance. Maybe a tech firm asking for an interview. But it all felt distant now. Clouded by doubt. His fingers traced the edge of a burned schematic. He remembered something his mom once told him before she passed. When people start talking behind your back, it means you're ahead of them. He wished she was still around to remind him. The next morning, a new rumor hit like a bombshell. Someone had created a fake email thread, allegedly between Eli and a Wildfire consultant. It suggested that Eli had stolen the consultant's notes during a public Q&A months before the fire. It was full of typos. Fake timestamps. But it looked real enough. And it spread like wildfire. By lunchtime, students were whispering in every corner. He plagiarized the whole thing. He probably paid someone to build it. He's a fraud. Marcy tried to push back. She confronted the biggest loudmouth, Tyler, near the gym lockers. Where's your proof, huh? She said, shoving her phone in his face. Here's his design from 2 years ago. It's time-stamped and posted on a maker forum. What you got? A fake screenshot? Tyler shrugged. People don't care about facts. They care about stories. And this one's juicier. Back at home, Eli sat with Jessica Klein, the woman from the State Innovation Foundation. She looked troubled. There's concern at the board level, she said gently. Not everyone is convinced your work is entirely original. We're going to have to pause the grant, just temporarily. Eli stared at her. So that's it? People lie, and I'm the one who gets punished. I'm sorry, she said. But we have a process. We need to be cautious. Eli nodded slowly. But inside, something cracked. Not anger. Not sadness. Resolve. That night, he climbed into the loft of the barn and pulled out a weather-beaten box. Inside were pages, blueprints, journals, hand-drawn notes, dating back years. Proof of every idea. Every test. Every failure. Every breakthrough. He scanned them. Then scanned them again. Then uploaded them all to a public archive. Here's everything. He titled it that. Simple. Unapologetic. The post went viral overnight. Thousands of downloads. Engineers from MIT and Caltech weighed in. This is legitimate, one wrote. A stunning display of innovation. A retired firefighter from Arizona commented, I've seen burnbacks fail. His design wouldn't have. He's the real deal. Within 48 hours, the narrative shifted. Again. But for Eli, it wasn't about fame anymore. It was about truth. And he was done hiding. Eli had just finished fixing the back gate of the chicken coop when the call came through. His hands were still dirty, fingernails packed with soil and grease, and his shirt was stained with old paint and fresh hay. A rooster strutted past like he owned the place, and Eli, momentarily distracted, didn't even notice his phone vibrating in his pocket. It buzzed again. Then again. He finally answered on the third try, panting slightly from rushing back up the porch steps. Hello. A calm, official-sounding voice replied, Is this Eli Turner? Yes. This is Rachel Denton. I'm calling from the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. The President would like to speak with you. Eli blinked. Wait, what? A few seconds of silence. Then a different voice came on. Deeper. Familiar. Eli, this is President Donald J. Trump. I've heard a lot about you. Eli's mouth went dry. The president continued. I saw your wildfire solution. I read the technical specs. Very impressive. You've got a brain. A big one. People said it couldn't be done. But you didn't just talk. You did something. We need more young people like that. Eli struggled to form words. I just wanted to help. Well, you did. Big help. Huge. I've got my team looking into ways to use your method nationwide. But first, I want to meet you in person. In person? Eli repeated. You're coming to D.C., son. We're flying you in. You'll brief our emergency response team, and you'll speak at a press conference with me. The American people need to see who you are. What do you say? Eli swallowed hard. His legs felt like rubber. I'd be honored, sir. 3 days later, Eli was sitting in a polished leather seat aboard Air Force Two, a government jet normally reserved for high-ranking officials. A Secret Service agent sat across from him, reading a dossier. Marcy sat next to him, wide-eyed, holding her phone but too stunned to scroll. They were surrounded by a small media team, security personnel, and an enthusiastic woman from FEMA named Veronica who couldn't stop gushing about Eli's schematics. You have no idea how many lives your design could save, she said. In dry conditions like we're seeing out west, your firewall system could be deployed by drones or set in seconds from airdrops. We've never seen anything like it. Eli nodded quietly. He was still adjusting to the idea that people were listening, really listening. The arrival in Washington was surreal. Cameras flashed. Reporters yelled questions. Uniformed men and women saluted. A sleek black car whisked them away to a secure entrance under the White House. As they moved through security and into the West Wing, Eli felt a strange mixture of pride and pressure. Every hallway echoed with history. Every face seemed to expect something of him. Inside the Roosevelt Room, several high-level advisors were already seated, along with the president himself. Trump stood and smiled broadly. Eli. The Wildfire kid. Come on in. They shook hands firmly. Trump gestured to the table. Sit, sit. Tell these people what you did. Don't hold back, we like smart people around here. Eli took a deep breath, opened his folder, and began. He walked them through his timeline, how he'd tested soil cooling agents using minerals found on his family's land, how he'd combined ancient firebreak methods with modern wind pattern modeling, and how he designed a system that didn't just stop wildfires, it redirected and suppressed them without chemical damage. The room grew quiet as he spoke. No one interrupted. When he finished, Trump leaned back and clapped slowly. Well, he said. They said a kid from a farm couldn't fix something the scientists haven't solved in 50 years. But you did it. That's what we call American spirit. He stood and addressed the room. I want a task force on this. We're going to pilot Eli's system in 3 high-risk states, California, Arizona, and New Jersey. Fast-track it. Use FEMA, the Department of the Interior, whatever you need. And Eli. He turned to him. I want you advising us directly. From the inside. You up for it? Eli blinked. Advising, the government? Trump grinned. That's right. Not bad for a kid who probably had to fix his own lawnmower last week. Laughter broke the tension. But Eli didn't laugh. He felt a spark inside. A new weight of responsibility. He'd come here to prove he wasn't a fraud. Now he was being asked to lead. Later, in the White House garden, Eli and Marcy sat on a bench, watching the sun dip behind the monument-lined skyline. Marcy nudged him. So, White House advisor, huh? He shook his head, still stunned. What even is my life right now? She smiled. You know, I used to think the world wasn't fair. That kids like us, working class, quiet, underestimated, were just stuck waiting for someone to notice. And now, he asked. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Now I think the world doesn't notice, until you shake it. But back in New Jersey, not everyone was celebrating. Principal Dorsey watched the press conference from his office, jaw clenched. He had hoped the rumors would bury Eli, or at least drag him back into mediocrity. Instead, the opposite happened. He turned to a copy of the school's newsletter on his desk. Eli's name was now being etched into the official wall of distinction. A school board member had demanded it. Dorsey's fingers tapped the desk. He wasn't done yet. Meanwhile, someone else had taken notice, too. Across the country, a mysterious figure in a dimly lit office stared at the screen, replaying Eli's presentation for the 3rd time. He jotted a note on a legal pad, revisit patent case. Explore sabotage opportunity. Threat to industry profits equals high. He picked up the phone. Yeah, it's me. We've got a problem. That kid's tech, if it rolls out, could cost us billions. We need to shut it down before it scales. Quietly. The ballroom at the Washington Convention Center buzzed with energy. Banners fluttered from the ceiling, colorful booths lined the polished floors, and a crowd of students, educators, scientists, and reporters packed into every inch of the space. The National Youth Science Expo was the biggest stage of its kind, and this year, all eyes were on one name. Eli Turner. Eli stood behind his booth, calm on the surface, but inside, his nerves danced like sparks off a live wire. The prototype of his wildfire suppression system stood proudly beside him, surrounded by diagrams, touchscreens, and a miniature simulation chamber that mimicked wind and fire patterns. He had run this demo 20 times in the last 3 days. It worked perfectly every time. But today, something felt off. "You okay?" Marcy asked, nudging his elbow. She was adjusting the display, her eyes darting over every detail like a protective older sister. "Yeah," Eli lied. "Just nerves." Marcy glanced around. "Well, if you weren't nervous, you'd be a robot. You've got the president's endorsement, national media attention, and half of NASA lurking near your booth pretending they're just interested parents." He managed a smile. Then a familiar voice pierced the crowd. "Turner." Eli turned to see Principal Dorsey, arms folded, flanked by 2 other school administrators. His smile was sharp, smug. Well, look who made it out of the cornfields." Eli straightened. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Oh, I'm not here for you," Dorsey said, glancing at the camera crews nearby. "I'm here representing our district. But make no mistake, I'll be watching closely." He walked off before Eli could reply. Marcy whispered, "Creep." At noon, Eli's scheduled demonstration began. Rows of spectators filled the seats in front of his booth. Reporters jostled for angles. Engineers in suits pulled out notepads. A small security detail stationed themselves nearby, courtesy of the White House. Eli stepped forward. "Thank you for being here. My name is Eli Turner, and today I'm going to show you a new way to fight wildfires, one that doesn't rely on expensive chemicals or heavy water drops." He launched into his presentation, walking through the principles of his design. The crowd leaned in. Heads nodded. The energy was electric. Then came the demo. Eli activated the simulation chamber, a sealed glass box with sand, terrain miniatures, and thin smoke generators to replicate a wildfire spread. Using a tablet, he adjusted the airflow and initiated the fire, represented by heat-mapping sensors and rising vapor. Next, he engaged the barrier burst system, a model of his real-world deployment device. It released a cooling mist and mineral compound that, in theory, suppressed heat spread while redirecting wind away from vegetation. It had worked every time before. But this time, nothing happened. The fire simulation kept spreading. The cooling mist didn't trigger. The airflow controls jammed. In front of a silent, watching crowd, Eli's system failed. Badly. Whispers erupted instantly. He must have faked it before. Overhyped. "I thought the White House said this was ready." Marcy rushed to the side of the booth. "Something's wrong with the wiring. This was working 2 hours ago." Eli stared at the chamber, frozen. His throat was tight. His mind raced. He opened the panel under the simulator. The core control cable had been cut, cleanly, with no fray, no tug, just a cold, surgical slice. Sabotage. But how? And why? Before he could speak, cameras were already snapping. A nearby reporter turned to a cameraman and muttered, "Get this on the 5 p.m. news, Team Wildfire Tech fails on national stage." That's the headline. Eli felt like the floor had vanished under him. Back at their hotel, Eli sat in silence. The phone calls were already coming in. One from the White House. One from FEMA. 3 from unknown numbers he didn't answer. Marcy paced the room. "Someone tampered with your setup. You know that, right? We need to report this." Eli didn't move. They got to it while we were at lunch, she went on. They knew how it worked. They knew where to cut. That wasn't some random hater, that was professional. Still, no response. You have to fight back. I don't even know who to fight, Eli finally said, voice low. This changes everything. I had one shot to prove myself in front of the scientific community, and now they think I'm a fraud. He rubbed his forehead. I should have seen this coming. Marcy stopped pacing. What are you talking about? There's too much money in Wildfire response, he said. Billions. Aircraft contracts. Chemical companies. If my tech works, those industries lose their grip. That makes me dangerous. He stood. But I'm not done. The next morning, Eli requested a private meeting with a cybersecurity expert from FEMA named Agent Darius Sloan, a former military investigator who specialized in intellectual property sabotage. Eli laid out everything, the design, the cut cable, the timing of the failure. Sloan narrowed his eyes. You're not the first to run into this, he said. Disruptive inventions in trillion-dollar industries don't just face criticism, they face covert suppression. You got attention from the White House. That means someone, somewhere, decided you're a threat. Can you help me find out who? Sloan nodded. Leave the booth to me. I'll sweep for prints, devices, footage. But in the meantime, don't back down. That's what they want. 2 days later, Eli received a package. Inside was a flash drive. No return label. No note. He plugged it into his laptop, heart pounding. A single video file loaded. It showed security footage, grainy, silent. A man in a maintenance uniform approached Eli's booth late at night. He crouched, pulled out a tool, and neatly sliced the cable. He never looked at the camera. But in one frame, his sleeve lifted. A tattoo. A symbol, a phoenix wrapped in flames. Marcy gasped. I've seen that before. That's the logo of Pyrotech Industries, the private contractor that supplies half the West Coast's aerial fire suppression chemicals. Eli's jaw tightened. It all made sense now. He wasn't just up against skeptics or jealous teachers. He was up against a machine, a billion-dollar behemoth that had no intention of letting a teenager from a dusty farm disrupt their empire. But they'd underestimated him. That night, Eli recorded a video. He sat in front of a white background, calm and direct. My name is Eli Turner. Some of you saw my Wildfire demo fail this week. What you didn't see was the sabotage behind it. Someone didn't want my solution to work. I now have proof, and I will be releasing it soon. He looked straight into the camera. I come from a family of farmers. We don't scare easy. I may be young, but I've got truth on my side, and I'm not going anywhere. The video went live at midnight. Within hours, it had over 1 million views. By morning, it was on every major news outlet. Teen scientist claims wildfire solution was sabotaged at National Expo, releases mysterious security footage. Eli Turner's face was everywhere. Clips from his video, edited with dramatic music, flooded TikTok, YouTube, and even Instagram Reels. News anchors debated it on air. Podcasts dissected his message. Scientists, celebrities, and wildfire survivors reposted it with hashtags like #Eli was sabotaged and #let him build. And then came the comments. Thousands of them. This kid's the real deal. Somebody's trying to bury him. That phoenix tattoo. Pyrotech is shady as hell. If you think billion-dollar corporations would let a teenage genius take their contracts, wake up. Protect Eli Turner at all costs. Eli sat in the hotel lobby, reading the storm he had ignited. But with each surge of support, a darker undercurrent flowed beneath the surface. He scrolled past one message in particular. It wasn't public. It had landed in his encrypted inbox. You should have kept quiet, farm boy. This is bigger than you. Walk away before you burn. No name. No sender. Just the threat. Marcy slammed her laptop shut. We need security. I already called Sloan, Eli replied. He's forwarding everything to federal authorities. She paced again, arms crossed. They're not just trying to ruin your invention anymore. Now they're coming after you. He nodded. That means they're scared. But we can't keep playing defense. We need to strike back, legally, publicly, whatever it takes. You have the proof. You have the country's attention. Eli stared at the glowing skyline outside the window. I have to finish the new prototype. You still want to build after all this? He looked at her. Especially after all this. They moved to a secure location outside D.C., a remote lab space loaned by a university professor who had seen Eli's video and believed in him. There, among boxes of salvaged parts, solar panels, turbine tubes, and coils, Eli worked day and night. He rebuilt the cooling system, redesigned the airflow mechanics, and upgraded the suppression powder release. Marcy handled media requests, coordinated with Sloan, and slept in 2-hour bursts on a cot. On the third day, Sloan returned with updates. We traced the tattoo to a former pyrotech field agent named Mason Lorne. He left the company 2 years ago after an internal investigation, allegedly for destroying competitor tech in an unauthorized field test. Let me guess, Eli said. The investigation went nowhere. Sloan smirked. Buried faster than a cactus in Nevada. But Lorne's not careful. He used a burner phone to talk to someone in a DC hotel room 2 hours before your demo was sabotaged. That's all we needed. You're going to arrest him? Not yet, Sloan said. We're building the case. But listen carefully, he's dangerous. If you see him, call me. Do not engage. Eli's heart raced. You think he's still watching me? Sloan nodded. Oh, I know he is. The next day, a powerful ally entered the fray. President Donald Trump tweeted. Young inventor Eli Turner sabotaged at Science Expo. His wildfire solution works, and deep state fire contractors don't like it. We're going to protect him and help him finish the mission. Stay tuned. The tweet exploded. An hour later, the president went live from the White House Rose Garden. Standing behind a podium flanked by Eli's prototype, Trump declared. This young man from a farm in New Jersey came up with a solution that could save thousands of acres, billions of dollars, and countless lives. But instead of being celebrated, he was targeted. We're going to find out who did it. And more importantly, we're going to fund this project and give Eli the team he needs. The cameras flashed. The nation listened. And Eli Turner, watching from the lab, felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. But hope wasn't the only thing coming for him. Later that night, while Eli reviewed his suppression algorithm, Marcy burst into the lab. Someone tried to break into the van, she said breathlessly. Eli ran outside. The side panel had been forced open. Inside, their backup prototypes were smashed. Data drives ripped out. The ignition was destroyed. They didn't want the van, Marcy said. They wanted to make sure you had no backup. Eli's mind snapped into motion. The master hard drive, it's in the toolbox. He sprinted back to the lab and yanked open the lower drawer. Gone. For the first time since the sabotage, Eli felt his hands shake. I encrypted everything, he said quietly. But if they get past it, they could delete everything, or worse, reverse engineer it and claim it as their own. Marcy's face turned white. That's exactly what they're trying to do. 2 hours later, Sloan returned. We have security footage, he said. Same guy. Mason Lorne. He's operating with military precision. Eli looked at him. Then why is he so afraid of a teenager with a toolbox? Sloane smiled grimly. Because you're the one threat they can't buy or bury. They moved Eli and Marcy to a different location, an off-grid facility owned by a wildfire response nonprofit. There, in silence, Eli began rebuilding his system for the third time. Only now, he wasn't working alone. Engineers started arriving from across the country. A former NASA scientist offered her lab time. A coding prodigy from MIT joined in remotely. A retired firefighter from California flew in with years of wildfire data. The movement had begun. Not just to finish a science project, but to take back control from an industry built on fear and fire. 2 days before Eli's rescheduled demo at a national press conference, Sloane came in with final news. We arrested Lorne. Got him on camera trying to bribe a janitor at your old expo booth. He cracked. Eli looked up. And? He named names. Pyrotech. 2 execs. A congressman who was feeding them expo security schedules. Marcy exhaled. Unbelievable. Sloane dropped a thick folder on the table. It's all here. They were going to discredit you and roll out their own version of your tech in 6 months. You were right to fight back. Eli opened the folder. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply said, let's finish this. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. But Eli had been awake for hours. In the quiet pre-dawn of the secure facility, he sat alone at a metal table, his hands trembling as he adjusted the final components of the wildfire suppression system. His mind raced through every detail, every calculation, every part, every connection. This was the moment that could define his entire life. His father's legacy was on the line. The future of countless lives at risk of wildfires was in his hands. He couldn't afford a single mistake. Outside, the early morning sky began to brighten, casting a soft glow across the barren desert. Marcy had called earlier to remind him, we're ready. This is your shot. But what if it wasn't enough? What if the tech failed? What if they tried to sabotage him again? Focus, Eli muttered to himself, hands steadying as he connected the final wire. By 9 a.m., the auditorium at the National Science Expo was packed. Reporters filled the rows, their cameras and microphones trained on the stage, where a large screen displayed the logo of the wildfire prevention technology demonstration. The buzz in the air was palpable. For months, the public had been waiting to see whether Eli's invention was the real deal. The controversy surrounding the sabotage had only made people more eager to see the young inventor's work for themselves. Inside the backstage area, Eli stood with Marcy and Sloane. They'd spent hours preparing for this moment, rehearsing their lines, securing the last-minute details. This is it, Eli, Marcy said, her voice a mixture of excitement and nervousness. You've got this. Sloane clapped him on the shoulder. Don't just show them your tech. Show them who you are. This is your time to prove them wrong. Eli nodded, his jaw clenched. He'd spent so many sleepless nights working toward this moment, pushing himself beyond the limits. He couldn't let the fear of failure cloud his mind now. Just before they were set to take the stage, Eli checked his phone one last time. It had been flooded with messages of encouragement, some from strangers, others from old classmates. But there was one message that made him pause. It was from his father. Proud of you, son. You've got this. Do it for the future. The simple words brought a lump to his throat. His father had always believed in him, even when Eli couldn't see the potential in himself. Now, more than ever, he had to prove that he wasn't just some farm boy with a pipe dream. The doors to the stage opened, and Eli, Marcy, and Sloane stepped out under the bright lights. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on Eli. His heart pounded, the pressure of the moment weighing down on him like 1,000 pounds. He walked toward the podium, adjusted the microphone, and smiled at the audience, trying to calm the jittery nerves in his chest. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice steady but not without a hint of nervousness. "Thank you for being here today. My name is Eli Turner, and I'm about to show you something that could change the way we fight wildfires forever." The room remained silent, awaiting his next words. Eli reached down to the control panel beside him, and with a press of a button, the large screen behind him lit up with a diagram of his wildfire suppression system. "This is the system that I've been working on," Eli continued. "It's a new approach to fighting wildfires, one that doesn't rely on traditional methods, but instead uses cutting-edge technology to stop fires before they spread. It uses a combination of automated drones, flame-retardant aerosol, and targeted cooling systems to contain fires quickly and efficiently." The room was still as Eli described the technology. Some of the scientists in the audience furrowed their brows, skeptical of the ambitious claims. Eli had seen this look before: doubt, skepticism, disbelief. He was used to it by now. But this time, it didn't matter. This time, he had the proof. Eli turned to the side and gestured to a large, open area where a small mock-up of a wildfire scenario had been set up. 2 massive flame generators had been placed at either end, and a simulated fire had been triggered in the middle. The system was ready. Eli hit the button on the remote, and the drones sprang to life, buzzing overhead. They moved with precision, each one releasing bursts of flame-retardant aerosol into the air. A second later, the cooling systems kicked in, creating a protective barrier around the fire's edge. Within minutes, the fire began to slow, then shrink, the simulated flames fading as the drones worked their magic. The audience gasped. They hadn't expected such a rapid response. They hadn't expected it to work at all. Eli stood back, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the simulation unfold. This was the moment, the one where he would either be hailed as a hero or buried under the weight of his failure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice louder now with a growing sense of triumph, "this is how we stop wildfires. And this is how we change the future." The applause was deafening. For a brief moment, Eli stood frozen, unsure whether the noise was real or just a figment of his imagination. He'd done it. He had shown them all that he wasn't just a kid with a crazy idea. He was a visionary. But then the applause died down, and a figure stood from the back of the room. It was Richard Carver, the CEO of Pyrotech. "Hold on," Carver said, his voice booming through the microphone. "I believe we need to take a closer look at this so-called solution." Eli's stomach dropped. He'd been expecting this. Pyrotech had been waiting for his demonstration, but Carver wasn't interested in praise. He was here to make sure Eli's technology didn't threaten his bottom line. Carver walked toward the stage, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Turner, I'm afraid this technology, as impressive as it is, can't be trusted in real-world scenarios. You've demonstrated how it works in a controlled environment, but let's talk about scalability. Let's talk about safety. Let's talk about the millions of dollars it would take to implement this nationwide." Eli took a deep breath. This wasn't the time to back down. "You're right," Eli said, stepping forward. "This is just the beginning. But I'm not here to talk about money or big corporations. I'm here to talk about saving lives. And if you're not willing to put people first, then maybe you should be the one stepping back." The audience gasped. This wasn't the response they had expected from the quiet farm boy who had once been mocked. But Eli had learned the hard way: sometimes, standing up for what's right meant taking risks. And in that moment, Eli knew one thing for sure: this fight was far from over. The storm clouds were gathering faster than Eli could have anticipated. In the wake of his demonstration, the media frenzy surrounding his wildfire suppression technology had only intensified. News outlets were abuzz, both praising and questioning his methods, but the most dangerous force was the one he couldn't escape: Pyrotech. Eli had known from the moment Richard Carver had walked onto that stage that things would not go smoothly. The CEO had done his best to undermine Eli's invention, dismissing it as a pipe dream not ready for real-world application. But Eli wasn't about to let the threat of corporate greed stand in his way. After the demonstration, Pyrotech's PR team had launched a full-scale attack, discrediting his system with claims of flawed data and unproven technology. Eli had hoped that his success would lead to support from government officials, but he soon realized the weight of Pyrotech's influence. The firefighting industry was a billion-dollar business, and Pyrotech had their hands in nearly every part of it. The more he fought, the more it felt like the whole world was stacked against him. But then, just when Eli thought things couldn't get worse, he received a surprising call from Marcy. "Eli, I think we need to talk," she said, her voice strained. "I've been hearing some things, and it's not good." "What's going on?" Eli's pulse quickened. "What happened?" "I just got off the phone with someone from the Department of Environmental Protection," Marcy said, her tone low. "They told me that Pyrotech is pushing for a nationwide ban on your system. They've already started making moves to stop the trial runs you were hoping for." Eli's heart sank. He'd been working for months to secure the trial, and now it seemed like Pyrotech was going to crush everything he'd worked for. But, how? The government can't just shut it down without reason. "They have the influence," Marcy replied. "The money, the lobbyists. You've seen it happen before. They're playing dirty." Eli didn't know whether to be angry or scared. He'd known Pyrotech would try to stop him, but this felt like more than just corporate sabotage. This was a full-scale attempt to erase him from the picture. "But don't worry," Marcy added, her voice more urgent now. "I've been in contact with someone who might be able to help. They don't want this to go down like this either." Eli paused, his thoughts racing. "Who? Who can help us?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You're not going to like it," Marcy said finally. "But, it's Richard Carver." Eli felt a lump form in his throat. Richard Carver, the man who had mocked him publicly, who had tried to ruin his invention with a single word, was reaching out to help. It didn't make sense. "I know how it sounds," Marcy continued. "But hear me out. Carver has influence, and he's willing to offer it, but only if you agree to one thing." "Which is?" Eli asked, his voice tight with skepticism. "He wants a seat at the table," Marcy explained. "He wants to be involved in your technology, be a partner, not an adversary. He thinks that if he can help you refine the system, he'll be able to sell it worldwide and make a fortune. But in exchange for his help, he wants a piece of the business." Eli's mind spun. On the one hand, the offer was tempting. Pyrotech had the resources to get the technology to the front lines of wildfires. With Carver's backing, Eli could see his invention implemented across the country. But something about it felt wrong, dirty. Would aligning with Pyrotech mean compromising his principles? Would it mean selling out everything he'd fought for? "I need time to think about this," Eli said, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "Thanks for telling me, Marcy. I'll let you know." Later that evening, as Eli walked back to his small apartment, he couldn't shake the thought of Richard Carver's offer. His father's words echoed in his mind, "Do what's right, no matter the cost." But what if doing the right thing meant sacrificing everything? As he entered his apartment, he was met with a familiar face, Sloane, standing by the kitchen counter, holding a glass of water. "You're still thinking about Carver's offer, huh?" Sloane said, reading Eli's expression before he even spoke. "I don't know what to think," Eli admitted, running a hand through his hair. It's hard to ignore the potential for change. His resources could make this real. But at what cost? I don't want to be just another cog in his machine. Sloane took a step forward. "I get it, Eli. Carver's a snake, but he's a snake with power. The thing is, you don't have to play by his rules. You've got something he doesn't, people who believe in you. That's a bigger advantage than anything Pyrotech can throw at you." Eli looked at Sloane, surprised by the fierceness in his friend's voice. But what about the trial runs? If we don't get Pyrotech's support, how are we supposed to get this thing off the ground? We don't need Carver, Sloane said, his voice steady. We need each other. We need the people who believe in you, Eli. Look, I've been talking to a few investors, and they're interested. If we push back against Carver, if we fight, we can get this system out there the right way, without compromising who you are or what you stand for. Eli looked at Sloane, his mind still whirling, but something in his chest lifted. Sloane was right. The world didn't need more corrupt businessmen, it needed people who were willing to take a stand for what was right, even when it was hard. I'm not going to let Pyrotech win, Eli said, his voice filled with determination. I'll find another way. We'll find another way. Sloane smiled. That's the Eli I know. The next day, Eli contacted Marcy to turn down Carver's offer. It was a risk, but he was ready to face it head-on. Pyrotech might have the money and power, but Eli had something far more important, the truth on his side. Later that afternoon, as Eli was preparing for the next phase of the fight, an unexpected knock came at his door. He opened it to find Laura Walker, a respected environmental lawyer who had been following his case closely. I heard you're not accepting Carver's deal, Laura said, stepping into the apartment. Good. Because I've got something for you that could change everything. The air felt thick with tension as Eli sat across from Laura Walker at the small coffee shop just down the street from his apartment. It was a nondescript place, perfect for quiet conversations where nothing could be overheard. But today, the weight of the conversation felt heavier than any of the technology or wildfire that had brought them together. Eli had just made the bold decision to reject Carver's offer, refusing to align himself with a man who seemed to have no moral compass. He knew the risks. Pyrotech was not a company that would let him walk away easily. But what Eli didn't anticipate was how quickly Carver's influence would start to spread, reaching into areas where Eli had hoped for support. Okay, Eli said, trying to steady his breathing, I've turned down Carver. Now what? Laura smiled faintly, her eyes sharp, as she leaned in. Now we fight. Carver's not the only one with power, Eli. We've got something he doesn't, public opinion. And trust me, it's on your side. But that doesn't mean Pyrotech won't pull out every trick in the book to shut you down. Eli sat back, running a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation growing heavier by the second. What exactly are we up against? The big question is how far they'll go to silence you. They've got deep pockets and an army of lawyers. But we've got something that they can't buy, an army of people who believe in you, and a system that could change how wildfires are fought. Eli nodded slowly. So, what's our next move? I've already spoken with a few environmental advocacy groups, Laura explained. And I've contacted several lawyers who specialize in cases like this one. If Pyrotech tries to block your invention, we'll have the media on our side, and we'll be ready to counter their tactics with a public relations campaign. We need to build up the case that what you've developed is not just innovative, it's essential for saving lives. Eli wasn't sure if the fight would be as easy as Laura was making it sound. The more he thought about the reach of Pyrotech, the more he realized just how large the mountain was that he was trying to climb. Still, he couldn't back down now. He'd come too far. The next few weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and legal wrangling. Eli couldn't remember the last time he'd had a full night's sleep. Between preparing for the legal battle, working with Laura's team, and dealing with mounting pressure from the media, he felt like he was constantly running on fumes. Marcy, too, had been a huge help, assisting Eli with organizing his documentation and securing the evidence he needed to prove that his system could work. The two of them spent countless hours revising presentations, gathering data, and speaking with environmental experts to back up their case. But despite all their preparation, the storm was only just beginning. One evening, Eli was sitting in his apartment, staring at his laptop, when his phone rang. It was Marcy. Eli, we've got a big problem, she said, urgency in her voice. Eli immediately sat up straighter, heart racing. "What's going on?" "Pyrotech just filed a formal injunction to block your system from being tested," Marcy said, her voice tight with frustration. "They're arguing that your technology is unproven and could cause more harm than good. They've got expert testimony lined up, and they're planning to make you look like a liability." Eli's chest tightened. "What does that mean? What happens now?" "You've got one shot at this," Marcy said. "Tomorrow, we're heading to court. We'll have a chance to present your case. But it's going to be tough." The next morning, Eli stood in the courthouse, staring at the polished wood and the cold stone floors. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room as he walked to the defendant's table. On the opposite side sat Richard Carver, flanked by a team of high-powered lawyers. Eli's stomach churned at the sight of him, but he had a job to do. He had to prove that his technology was not just viable, it was necessary. Laura gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder as they took their seats. "You've got this, Eli. Just stick to the facts. You've worked too hard for this to let them tear you down now." Eli nodded, swallowing hard. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, the magnitude of it all hit him. Pyrotech's lawyers would argue that his system wasn't safe. They would use every trick in the book to make it look like he was the one putting people's lives at risk. And it was up to him, and Laura, to prove them wrong. The judge entered the room, and the proceedings began. The first few hours felt like a blur. The lawyers for Pyrotech were slick, confident, and ruthless. They presented their case with precision, using expert witnesses to discredit Eli's work. They argued that there were too many unknowns in Eli's technology, that it wasn't ready for widespread use, and that it was an untested risk. Eli couldn't help but feel the weight of their words as they sliced through his defense. He'd put so much of himself into his work, how could they dismiss it like this? Then, it was Eli's turn to testify. His palms were clammy, and his throat felt tight as he stepped to the stand. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears. Laura had coached him, reminding him to stay calm and collected, but it was easier said than done. As the questions from the opposing lawyers came, Eli felt his frustration rise. How could they not see the potential of what he had created? But then, something shifted. He remembered what his father had told him long ago: "Don't let fear control you. Stand your ground, and speak your truth." Taking a deep breath, Eli straightened up, his voice steady. "I didn't create this system to make money," he began. "I created it because I've seen the devastation that wildfires cause. I've lost people I love to fires, and I'm not going to stand by and do nothing. Pyrotech's system is outdated. My system is not just a new approach, it's a life-saving technology. I'm not asking for handouts. I'm asking for the chance to prove it." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Eli saw a flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of the opposition. He had them on the ropes, but the battle was far from over. As the court adjourned for the day, Eli found himself back at his apartment, staring out the window into the night. The day's events had left him emotionally drained, but there was a fire inside him now, one that wouldn't go out until the fight was over. Tomorrow, the battle would continue. But for tonight, Eli allowed himself a moment of quiet. He had spoken his truth, and no matter what happened next, he had done all he could. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The courthouse was a battleground. Eli had never imagined that his fight would take place under the harsh lights of a legal arena, but here he was, sitting on the edge of his seat, watching as the stakes grew higher with every passing moment. The morning after his testimony, he found himself back in the war room, an unassuming conference room in Laura's office building. It was filled with half-empty coffee cups and scattered papers, but what truly filled the room was tension. Pyrotech's legal team was relentless, and Eli could feel the weight of their attack pressing down on him. But in the silence of the room, there was a hum of possibility. They might be up against a giant, but Eli had learned one thing: giants can fall. Okay, Eli, Laura said, her voice steady but urgent, we've got to push back. We need something big, something that will shift the narrative. We can't let them paint you as a reckless inventor. Eli leaned forward, his mind still reeling from yesterday's testimony. What do we have left? What can we use against them? Laura pulled a large file from the stack on the table. This. We've been waiting for this information for a while now, this could be the key. Eli took the file from her hands, feeling his heart race as he opened it. Inside were pages of reports, diagrams, and technical specifications, data from the wildfire control trials Eli had run before the legal battle began. His testing had been thorough, and it had proven that his technology could be deployed safely and effectively. But more importantly, buried within the data was a shocking revelation. What is this? Eli asked, his fingers tracing the lines of text. The numbers are clear, Laura said. We found discrepancies in Pyrotech's own data. They've been falsifying parts of their fire suppression technology's efficiency claims. Some of the documents from their testing are doctored. What they've been using to prove their system's superiority doesn't even match up with the real results. Eli's breath caught. This was it. The game changer. Are you sure? Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had hoped for something like this, but seeing it on paper made it real. I've double-checked it with experts. It's legitimate, Laura replied. This is the evidence that could turn everything around. We can show the court that Pyrotech has been misleading regulators and the public about the efficacy of their system. Eli stood up, his pulse quickening. He couldn't believe what he was holding. For the first time since this all started, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't just fighting for his invention anymore. He was fighting for the truth. The next few hours felt like a whirlwind as Eli, Laura, and the team scrambled to prepare their next move. The breakthrough data was crucial, but they needed to present it carefully. One wrong step, and it could backfire. They couldn't afford to misstep now. That afternoon, Eli stood in front of a group of reporters outside the courthouse. Laura was beside him, along with a handful of environmental advocates who had thrown their support behind his cause. The press had been following the case for weeks, and Eli could feel the cameras trained on him, waiting for him to speak. He took a deep breath, adjusting the mic in front of him. The tension in the air was palpable, but Eli knew what he had to do. Thank you all for being here today, Eli began, his voice steady. I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm here because we have a responsibility, to our communities, to our forests, and to our future, to make sure that we're using the best available technology to fight wildfires. He paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd. Today, I'm here to expose something that Pyrotech doesn't want you to know. For months, they've claimed that their system is the most effective on the market, but we've uncovered something that changes everything. Pyrotech has been misleading the public about the true efficiency of their technology. The data they've been using to claim superiority has been doctored. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed as reporters whispered to one another. Eli could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he pressed on. I didn't start this journey for fame or for money. I started it because I lost my father to a wildfire. I've seen firsthand the devastation these fires cause, and I refuse to stand by while companies like Pyrotech put profits over people's lives. This isn't just about a product. This is about lives. And it's time we put an end to the deception. Eli stepped back, his hands shaking slightly, but he felt a sense of pride swell within him. He had just told the world the truth. That evening, Eli and his team watched as the news reports came in, one after another, breaking the story about Pyrotech's misleading claims. The media frenzy was overwhelming. They were no longer just the underdog in a fight for survival. Eli had become a symbol of resistance. The support from the public was pouring in, messages of encouragement, social media posts, and petitions. But while the media and public were rallying behind him, Eli knew the legal battle was far from over. Pyrotech would fight back with everything they had. He couldn't afford to let his guard down now. The next day, Eli found himself in court again, sitting in the same courtroom that had been the setting of so much tension and uncertainty. But today was different. Today, Eli had something they couldn't ignore. As the judge called the session to order, Eli looked across the room at Pyrotech's legal team. Their confident demeanor had shifted. Richard Carver, who had been so smug in previous hearings, now looked uneasy. He leaned forward, whispering to his attorneys, but Eli could see that the fight was taking a toll on them. Their calm composure was cracking. "Your Honor," Laura said, standing up to present the new evidence, "we have uncovered that Pyrotech has been falsifying their efficiency reports. The documents we've gathered show that their system is not as effective as they claim, and it's being presented to the public in a way that is both misleading and dangerous." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom as the documents were passed to the judge. For the first time, Eli could see that Pyrotech's legal team was on the back foot. The momentum was shifting, and for the first time since he'd started this fight, Eli felt a sense of control. The hearing stretched late into the day. When the judge called for a recess, Eli stepped out into the hallway with Laura, his mind racing. The fight wasn't over, but this breakthrough had shifted the balance of power. Now, they had to keep pressing, keep pushing forward. "We've done it, Eli," Laura said, her voice a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We've got them where we want them." Eli nodded slowly, still processing the weight of the moment. "This isn't over yet. But for the first time, I feel like we might actually win." The morning of the next court session felt different. The air was heavy with anticipation, and Eli could sense the shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The breakthrough had turned the tables in their favor, but Eli knew better than to get too comfortable. Pyrotech wasn't going to give up easily. Laura had briefed him on the plan for the day. Today, they would present the irrefutable evidence that could seal their victory. If Pyrotech's legal team had any tricks left up their sleeves, they would throw them all out now. And Eli was prepared for whatever came next. As they entered the courtroom, Eli could already see the tension between the opposing sides. The once confident Pyrotech lawyers now looked uneasy, but Richard Carver, their lead attorney, had an air of determination about him. He wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. The judge, an older man with a stern expression, called the court to order. Eli sat in the witness stand, his hands gripping the edges of the chair as he steadied himself. This was it. The culmination of everything he had fought for, his father's memory, the lives lost to wildfires, and the future of his invention. "I trust we're all prepared," the judge said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. Laura stood up, ready to present the case. "Your Honor, members of the court, today we present evidence that Pyrotech's claims about their wildfire suppression system have been false. We've uncovered data that demonstrates not only the inaccuracy of their reported efficiency but also evidence of tampering with crucial testing results." Eli looked around the room, feeling the weight of every eye on him. This was no longer just about technology, this was about justice. He remembered his father's face, the man who had lost everything to a wildfire and whose memory had been the driving force behind his journey. This was for him. Carver stood up, ready to counterattack. "Your Honor, these claims are baseless and unfounded. The data presented by the defense has been manipulated, and we're confident that Pyrotech's system is still the best solution for wildfire control on the market. What the plaintiffs have presented is nothing more than an attempt to discredit the very people who are working to save lives." Eli could feel the tension rise. Carver's voice was smooth, his words calculated. He had been playing the long game, relying on his reputation to win over the judge. But Eli wasn't about to let him sway the court today. "Your Honor," Laura interrupted, standing with confidence, "we've backed up our claims with solid evidence. Pyrotech's system is not as effective as they've led the public to believe, and we've proven that their data is flawed." The truth is, we've been given a window into how far they've gone to conceal the inefficiency of their technology. The courtroom was dead silent as the judge looked over the documents. Eli's heart raced, and for a moment, he wondered if the judge would side with Pyrotech's legal team. But after what felt like an eternity, the judge set the documents down and addressed the room. "I'm prepared to consider the evidence presented," he said, his voice calm but firm. "However, I will need further testimony before we can move forward with any conclusion. I want to hear from both sides, in full, and I expect nothing but transparency." Eli exhaled, grateful that the judge hadn't dismissed their evidence outright. But the fight wasn't over. They still had to prove that Pyrotech's technology wasn't just ineffective, it was dangerous. Later that day, Eli sat in a small conference room with Laura and the team, discussing their next steps. The court session had gone well, but the pressure was building, and they still needed to find a way to show the court just how dire the consequences of using Pyrotech's system could be. "I've been thinking," Eli said, pacing back and forth, his mind racing. "We need to get our hands on more of their test results, real test results, not the ones they've manipulated. We need to show that their system failed on a larger scale, and we need to prove it in front of the court." Laura nodded, her brow furrowing. "That's a good idea. But we don't have much time. We need to move fast." "We can do this," Eli said, his voice filled with conviction. "We can still win. But we need to go after their biggest weakness, their system's inability to contain the fire when it matters most." The next morning, Eli and Laura were back in the courtroom, ready to present their final argument. They had found another piece of evidence, an internal Pyrotech memo that discussed the limitations of their system during the worst conditions. The memo was damning, and it was about to take center stage. "This document," Laura began, holding up the memo for the courtroom to see, was part of an internal review conducted by Pyrotech's engineers. "It's clear from the language used here that they knew their system had limitations, and yet they continued to promote it as the perfect solution for wildfire control." The judge nodded, leaning forward. "Continue, Ms. Sullivan." "This memo," Laura said, her voice steady, describes how, under extreme conditions, Pyrotech's technology failed to suppress wildfires effectively. In some cases, their system was unable to contain the fire before it reached populated areas. They were fully aware of this flaw, but they chose not to disclose it. Eli watched as the courtroom shifted. Carver's face had gone pale. He wasn't prepared for this. The memo was a smoking gun, and there was no way around it. As the session adjourned for the day, Eli stepped outside the courthouse, his mind still racing. The battle wasn't over, but they had crossed a major hurdle. The public was behind them, the evidence was on their side, and the truth was finally out in the open. "We're getting close, Eli," Laura said, her voice filled with relief. "I think we've got them." But Eli knew the fight wasn't over yet. There was still one last push to make, and he wasn't going to stop until Pyrotech's lies were exposed for good. They had come this far, and they weren't about to let the truth be buried again. The court session began with a heavy silence hanging over the room. Eli sat at the defense table, his hands clenched tightly, the familiar tension in his chest tightening with every passing moment. Today would be the day when everything would either come to a head or fall apart. This was the final showdown, and Eli wasn't about to back down. As the judge entered, his usual solemn demeanor cast a shadow over the room. He looked over his glasses at the attorneys on both sides, then at Eli, who was sitting still but with a fire burning in his eyes. The judge took his seat and banged the gavel. "Let us proceed," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed more than enough courtroom theatrics. "Mr. Carver, you may begin with your closing statement." Richard Carver stood up, adjusting his tie, the confident air about him that Eli had seen all throughout the trial still present. He had been a formidable opponent, and Eli couldn't underestimate him. But today, something felt different. Today, Carver looked slightly rattled. "Your Honor," Carver started, his voice cool, we've heard a lot of sensational claims in this courtroom. But the truth is, Pyrotech's wildfire suppression system remains the best available technology. The plaintiffs have brought forth documents, memos, and other evidence, all of which have been meticulously dissected and proven irrelevant. Eli leaned forward slightly. He knew Carver would attack, but he was ready for it. The evidence they had, the memo, the internal reviews, was irrefutable. Pyrotech had known their system wasn't perfect, and they had failed to disclose its dangers. But Carver was skilled at playing to the judge's biases, and Eli couldn't let him win with just words. Carver continued. This case has always been about personal vendettas and unfounded fears. No one can deny that Pyrotech's technology has saved lives during wildfires. But now, at the 11th hour, we are being told that it is not enough. We're being asked to ignore decades of progress in the field of fire suppression. His words hung in the air like smoke, thick and poisonous. The tension in the room was palpable. Eli could feel the eyes of the court on him, waiting to hear his side. But he was ready. He stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch for just a moment longer before speaking. Your Honor, members of the court, Eli began, his voice calm but steady. This isn't about personal vendettas. This isn't about fear. This is about the truth. Pyrotech's system is not the breakthrough they claim it to be. It's a failure, one that has cost lives and one that continues to risk the safety of countless people. What we've presented here isn't sensational, it's the truth. He let his words sink in before continuing. We have provided undeniable evidence that Pyrotech knew their system wasn't ready for the scale of wildfires we are facing today. The memo we showed you earlier outlines their own acknowledgement of its limitations. And yet, they continued to sell it as the solution for wildfire suppression, knowing full well it was inadequate in the worst conditions. The truth is, Pyrotech has been more interested in their profits than in the safety of the communities they've claimed to protect. Eli's words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. He could feel the shift in the room. People were no longer looking at him as the underdog, now, they were seeing him as the voice of reason. Carver's smirk faltered, and for the first time, Eli saw doubt in his opponent's eyes. Pyrotech has done good work, Eli continued, his tone softer now. But when it comes to matters of life and death, good isn't good enough. We need the best. And that's why my team and I have worked tirelessly on a better solution. One that can actually contain fires before they ravage entire communities. One that doesn't make empty promises. The courtroom was silent. Eli's words had struck a chord. He could see the judge scribbling notes, his eyes not leaving Eli for a second. Carver, realizing that he was losing control of the narrative, tried to regain his composure. Your Honor, the defense has misrepresented our technology. They're trying to discredit a company that has been at the forefront of wildfire suppression for years. Their technology is unproven. There's no evidence that it could perform as well as Pyrotech's system. But Eli wasn't done. He stood taller now, his eyes fixed on the judge. And there's no evidence that Pyrotech's system can perform as promised, either. The truth is, Pyrotech has been lying to the public for years. They've been covering up failures, hiding the data that proves their system doesn't work when it's needed most. We've seen the results of their failure. I've seen it firsthand. His voice cracked for a moment, the weight of his father's memory hitting him again. He had promised his father that he would make a difference. He wasn't going to let Pyrotech's lies stand in the way of that. Your Honor, Eli said, his voice firm once more. I'm not asking you to choose sides. I'm asking you to look at the truth. The evidence we've provided speaks for itself. We have the better solution, and it's time for Pyrotech to be held accountable for their actions. There was a moment of silence as the judge let Eli's words settle. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The gavel struck, and the judge cleared his throat. I've heard enough, the judge said. The court will recess until tomorrow. I will review all evidence and deliver my decision at that time. The tension didn't fade as Eli and Laura exited the courtroom. He could feel the weight of the moment hanging over him. The outcome was still uncertain, but the battle was far from over. Pyrotech would make one final push tomorrow, and Eli had to be ready. The day had arrived. The courtroom was filled with an electric charge, the kind of tension that could only be cut by the verdict that would determine the fate of Eli's future, and, more importantly, the future of wildfire suppression in America. Eli's heart pounded in his chest, his palms damp with sweat. It felt as if everything had led to this single moment. As the doors opened, Eli and Laura filed into the courtroom, their footsteps echoing down the aisle. The same judge who had presided over the case for weeks now sat at the bench, his face unreadable. Beside him were the two opposing counsel, Richard Carver and Eli's own lawyer, who sat quietly, nervously tapping his pen on the table. Eli sat down, glancing at the faces of the jurors who had witnessed the battle unfold in real time. He tried to read their expressions, searching for any sign of how the case might have been swayed. But they were all stone-faced, their eyes fixed ahead. Only the occasional glance toward Eli suggested any sort of empathy, or perhaps pity. "Order in the court," the judge called out, bringing the room to an immediate hush. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before speaking in the solemn tone that always preceded the moment of truth. "I've reviewed all of the evidence presented, listened to the arguments on both sides, and considered the implications of this case on the larger issue of wildfire suppression in the United States. It is my duty to ensure that justice is served and that the truth is revealed." Eli felt his throat tighten. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about the truth, the one thing Pyrotech had tried to bury. He glanced over at the opposing counsel, Richard Carver, who sat poised and calm, his demeanor as collected as ever. But Eli could sense it, the desperation beneath the cool exterior. Pyrotech knew they were cornered. The judge continued, his words now carrying an air of finality. "The case before us is one of immense consequence, not only for the parties involved but for the safety of the people in this nation. Lives have been lost, and others are at risk. But as I have said from the beginning, this case is about facts. It is about accountability. And most importantly, it is about the future." Eli could feel the weight of those words. The future, his future, and the future of the people who had been affected by wildfires, were all riding on this verdict. The judge paused, taking a deep breath as the room remained still. Eli's fingers twitched on the table, his mind racing. "I find in favor of the plaintiffs," the judge finally announced, his voice heavy. "Pyrotech is held responsible for failing to disclose critical information about the limitations of their wildfire suppression technology. The evidence presented was compelling. Pyrotech knew about the flaws in their system and chose to conceal them in order to protect their profits. This is unacceptable." Eli's heart surged. The words he had waited for so long to hear were finally spoken. It wasn't over, but this was the moment that had set everything into motion. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but the judge raised his hand to silence the room. "I order that Pyrotech be held financially responsible for the damages caused by their faulty technology. Furthermore, their claims of effectiveness must be publicly corrected, and they are to cease all sales of their system until a full review and improvement of the technology is completed. Eli Spencer, your invention, which has shown promise, will be given the opportunity to undergo official trials." Eli could hardly believe it. The weight of the decision slowly sank in. Pyrotech had been held accountable. His system would be put to the test, and for the first time, Eli could see a clear path forward, a path that had once seemed so far out of reach. Carver's face had gone ashen, his confident posture deflating in an instant. He looked like a man who had lost everything. It was a satisfying sight for Eli, but he didn't have time to gloat. There was still much to do. Eli glanced at Laura, who was sitting beside him, her face lit with a quiet joy. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, but even she knew that the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. As the judge concluded the hearing, Eli stood up, his legs feeling like jelly beneath him. His hands shook slightly as he reached for Laura's hand, and for a moment, they stood there, in the eye of the storm, knowing they had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Outside the courtroom, reporters flooded the hallway, their cameras flashing as they surrounded Eli and Laura. Questions flew at them from every direction, but Eli's mind was already elsewhere. His thoughts were on his father, on the legacy he was determined to carry forward. It had taken everything to get to this point, but it felt like a new chapter was beginning. The weight of responsibility was now on his shoulders. Eli Spencer had proven that the impossible was possible. But the true test was just beginning. The world would now be watching. And for Eli, there was no turning back. The trials were set to begin, and Eli Spencer couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment where everything would either fall into place or crumble to dust. The small testing site in the hills of California had been chosen carefully. The dry, dusty landscape provided the perfect setting for his wildfire suppression system to prove itself under real-world conditions. It was a place where every small detail would be scrutinized, and every flaw would be exposed. As Eli stood at the edge of the site, watching the preparations unfold, a knot of nervous energy twisted in his stomach. The world was watching him now. He could feel the weight of it, his invention, his family's hopes, the pressure to succeed. But there was something else, too. A flicker of hope that burned brighter than the doubt that had plagued him in the past. "Are you ready for this?" Laura's voice broke through his thoughts, steady and calm. She stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. Eli nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was convincing himself or her. "I think so. It's just, everything we've worked for is riding on this." Laura squeezed his shoulder, offering a smile that held both reassurance and strength. "You've done the impossible before. You can do it again." Her words stuck with him as they walked toward the command center, where a group of scientists, engineers, and reporters had already gathered. The system, his system, was ready. The large white tent housing the machinery was set up in the center of the site, its intricate design humming with the quiet promise of innovation. This was what he had worked for, a machine capable of stopping fires before they could devastate entire communities. The testing phase wasn't just a trial of technology, it was a trial of trust. Pyrotech's system had failed, and now Eli had to prove his design was superior, that it could withstand the challenges of an unpredictable wildfire. "Eli," a voice called, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Dr. Vanessa Lee, one of the lead scientists overseeing the trial. She had been among the first to endorse Eli's system after the court ruling, and now she stood beside him, clipboard in hand. "The test is set to begin. We're starting with a controlled fire to see how the system responds. We'll increase the intensity gradually." Eli nodded, his heart pounding. This was it. The controlled fire was just the beginning, a precursor to a real wildfire. A test of endurance, of speed, of the system's ability to adapt to an ever-changing situation. "I'm ready," Eli said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind inside him. As the team activated the system, a series of screens lit up, displaying real-time data. Eli stood alongside Laura and Vanessa, his eyes glued to the numbers. The fire began to spark at the far end of the testing site, its flames licking the sky as it spread quickly across the dry ground. It was a small fire, nothing compared to the devastation a full-fledged wildfire could cause, but it was more than enough to test the system's capabilities. "Fire's ignited," Vanessa said, tapping a few keys on her tablet. "Starting the suppression system now." The hum of machinery filled the air as the suppression system came online. Eli watched in awe as the devices slowly began to deploy, releasing a fine mist of water combined with fire-suppressing agents into the air. The wind blew the mist in every direction, creating a protective barrier around the fire's perimeter. For a moment, it seemed like the system might be working perfectly. The fire began to slow, the mist enveloping the flames, pushing back the heat. Eli allowed himself a brief moment of optimism. Perhaps this would be the turning point he had hoped for. But just as quickly as hope blossomed, the flames began to rise again. The system faltered. The mist was not enough to contain the growing intensity of the fire. It spread faster than expected, consuming the area the suppression system was meant to protect. No, no, no. Eli muttered under his breath, his mind racing. He watched the numbers on the screen flicker and fluctuate, indicating that the suppression agents were not dispersing in the required quantities. The system was malfunctioning. He turned to Vanessa. What's happening? It's not supposed to act like this. Vanessa's face was a mask of concentration as she examined the data. The wind's shifting unpredictably. The mist isn't being distributed evenly. We need to recalibrate the system. Eli's heart sank. They couldn't afford to waste any time. Not now. Not with everything at stake. I'll go check the equipment, he said, already moving toward the control panel. Keep the data running. I need to see if the calibration is off. Laura followed closely behind, her face etched with concern. Eli, it's okay. We can fix this. You've got this. Eli forced a tight smile as they approached the system's main interface. The suppression agents were dispersing too quickly on one side, while other parts of the field were left unprotected. Eli quickly adjusted the settings, using his knowledge of the system's mechanics to fine-tune the output. It wasn't perfect, but he knew it would help. As he worked, the fire continued to grow, the wind pushing it in unpredictable directions. It was an unforgiving environment. There was no room for error. But Eli didn't allow himself to panic. He couldn't. Not now. Finally, the system began to respond. The flames slowed once more. The mist expanded, engulfing the fire with more control, more precision. It wasn't the ideal result, but it was progress. A glimpse of what the system could truly do when fully calibrated. The controlled fire was finally subdued, and the team breathed a collective sigh of relief. Eli stood, sweat dripping down his forehead, but there was a small spark of pride that ignited in his chest. The system had worked, not perfectly, but it had worked. It's a step forward, Vanessa said, offering him a tired but proud smile. We'll need to keep refining it, but this is good. Really good. Eli nodded, his mind already racing with ideas on how to improve the system. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of doubt begin to lift. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But Eli Spencer had taken the first step toward proving that the impossible was possible. And he wasn't about to stop now. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the hills of California, but Eli Spencer barely noticed. His eyes were glued to the horizon, watching as the smoke began to billow, thick and dark, signaling the start of a real wildfire. This wasn't the controlled fire they'd tested earlier, this was a true force of nature, unpredictable and dangerous. Everything was ready. The suppression system, which had shown promising results during the smaller trial, was about to face its toughest challenge yet. This wasn't just about proving it could stop a fire, it was about proving that it could save lives, protect entire communities. If the system failed now, Eli knew there would be no second chance. The world would move on, and he would be nothing more than another failed inventor, another forgotten dreamer. Everything's in position, Vanessa said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of excitement. The wind is strong, which means we'll need to be fast and precise. Eli nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had designed the system to withstand these conditions, but no amount of preparation could fully predict how this fire would behave. Wildfires were chaotic by nature, and this one was no different. The winds were high, gusting unpredictably, pushing the flames in all directions. It would be a true test of his invention's capabilities. Activate the system, Eli said, his voice calm despite the storm of thoughts inside him. The command center buzzed with activity as the team triggered the deployment of the suppression system. The large, robotic arms that housed the mist dispensers swung into position, and the network of sensors and nozzles whirred to life. Eli watched the screens, his fingers trembling slightly as he keyed in the final adjustments. The data was streaming in, showing real-time feedback on the fire's behavior and the system's response. The fire was approaching quickly now. The first wave of heat hit them as the flames began to roll down the hillside. The system's mist was deployed in a fine spray, dispersing in the air, attempting to cover as much of the fire's perimeter as possible. The first moments were promising. The mist began to slow the fire's advance. The flames, though still fierce, seemed to be dampened by the cloud of fire-suppressing agents. But then, the wind shifted. The fire roared louder, gusting toward the left side of the perimeter, where the system's coverage wasn't as dense. Eli cursed under his breath. This was the problem: wildfires didn't respect boundaries. They didn't play by any rules. "Left flank is compromised," shouted Vanessa. She was watching the wind patterns on her screen, tracking the fire's new direction. "Increase mist deployment on the left. We need more coverage now." Eli's hands flew over the control panel, making quick adjustments. The system was designed to adapt to changing conditions, but the intensity of this fire was unlike anything they had experienced before. He held his breath as the mist sprayers on the left flank ramped up, releasing more agents into the air. For a moment, it seemed to work. The flames on the left side of the perimeter began to retreat slightly, their intensity dulling as the mist enveloped them. Eli allowed himself a small breath of relief, but it was short-lived. The fire on the other side was growing, the heat more intense than he had anticipated. Wind speeds increasing, Laura called out from her station. "We're not going to be able to control this with the current settings. It's too fast." Eli's heart pounded. This was the moment. This was where everything could go wrong. "Adjust the mist dispersers to full capacity," he ordered, his voice tight. "We're not going to let this thing get out of hand." The command center erupted into action as the team adjusted the system to its maximum output. Eli's eyes darted between the screens, watching the numbers climb higher as the system worked overtime to release more fire-suppressing mist into the air. The flames were being pushed back, slowly, inch by inch. But every moment of success was followed by another shift in the wind, another wave of fire pushing toward them from an unexpected direction. "Not enough," Vanessa muttered, staring at the screen. "The fire's too widespread. The system can't keep up." Eli felt his stomach drop. This was the moment of truth. He had spent years developing this system, pouring his soul into every piece of it. And now, standing at the edge of a real wildfire, he could see its limitations. There was only so much the mist could do against the raw power of nature. But then, something clicked in Eli's mind. He remembered his father's words from all those years ago: "When you don't have enough, you find a way to make more." "Wait," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "We need to go bigger. Not just more mist, more force." "Eli, what are you thinking?" Laura asked, her voice filled with concern. Eli's fingers flew over the controls, entering a new set of commands. He was about to override the system's default settings, pushing it to its limits. If this worked, it could be the breakthrough he needed, but if it didn't, the system could fail entirely. "Eli, no," Vanessa began, but Eli was already pressing the final button. The system hummed, a deep, mechanical sound filling the air as the mist dispensers deployed a concentrated jet of suppressant agents. It wasn't as fine and diffuse as before, it was powerful, forceful, designed to knock back the flames with sheer strength. The fire on the left side of the perimeter was hit first, the mist enveloping the flames in a thick cloud that seemed to force them to retreat. For a moment, there was silence. The fire slowed, its intensity weakening as the mist made contact with the heat. Eli held his breath, watching the fire, waiting for any sign that it was still pushing forward. Slowly, the flames began to die down, the fire's progression halted. "We're holding it," Vanessa said, her voice filled with disbelief. "It's actually working. The fire is retreating." Eli felt his heart race with triumph, but there was no time to celebrate. The wind was still shifting, and the fire wasn't done yet. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The real test was still ahead. Would the system be able to maintain its effectiveness as the fire continued to spread and intensify? Or was this just a brief victory before everything fell apart? Eli didn't have time to think about that now. He had won one small victory, and that was enough. For now, he would fight to keep this fire contained. The future of his system, and the future of countless lives, depended on it. The roar of the fire continued to thunder in the distance, but for a brief moment, the crew at the command center allowed themselves to breathe. Eli watched the screens in front of him, tracking the fire as it slowed, its ferocity dimming under the pressure of the suppressant mist. It wasn't gone, but it was contained, for now. Vanessa turned to Eli, her face pale with exhaustion but showing a faint trace of relief. "It's working," she said quietly, as though still unsure whether to believe it. "We've actually got it under control." Eli's heart was pounding, his hands shaking from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The system had worked. It wasn't perfect, but it had held. It had done what no one had believed possible. The fire that had threatened to tear through the countryside was now slowing, retreating as the mist blanketed the flames. But as the immediate danger began to subside, Eli knew that the battle wasn't over. There was still so much more to do, so many uncertainties. Could the system continue to handle the relentless onslaught of the fire? What if the wind shifted again? What if the fire spread faster than they could suppress it? He looked over at the other monitors. The fire was still burning across several miles of dry, wooded land, but their system had kept it contained within the perimeter they had set. It was an uncertain victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Eli's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his father, his words short and direct. "You did good, son. I'm proud of you." For a moment, Eli let the words sink in. His father, the man who had taught him everything about perseverance, about standing firm in the face of adversity, had never been quick to show approval. But now, for the first time in years, Eli felt the weight of his father's pride, and it brought a strange warmth to his chest. "Dad would have been here, if he could," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "What?" Vanessa asked, stepping closer. Eli looked up, forcing a smile. "Nothing. Just thinking about how far we've come." But despite the moment of personal reflection, the reality of the situation still loomed large. Eli could feel the weight of the fire's intensity hanging over them like a dark cloud, and he knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Not yet. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "This is Fire Command 5. We need more reinforcements. The fire's still spreading eastward. The mist is holding for now, but we can't keep this contained on our own. We need backup." Eli turned to the screen, his brow furrowing. The fire hadn't been stopped. It was still creeping toward vulnerable areas, areas where the system hadn't yet been deployed. They were holding their ground, but the full extent of the fire was still too much for the system to handle alone. They needed more resources, more people, more equipment. "Damn it," Eli muttered under his breath. "We need to double down. The system's holding, but we need to keep it up. Let's go, people, no time to waste." Vanessa nodded, already communicating with the field teams to coordinate reinforcements. They would need to bring in more supplies, more men, to help keep the fire at bay. Every minute that passed, the fire spread, and it wasn't just the system that needed help, it was the people out there, the firefighters on the ground, the families living in the path of destruction. Eli looked over at the readouts from the system. It was working, but barely. The suppressant mist was holding back the fire, but not by much. The sheer size of the blaze, combined with the shifting winds, made it difficult to keep up. Each gust of wind felt like a new threat, one they couldn't predict, one that could undo all their hard work. "We can't afford to keep pushing this system too far," Eli said, his voice tinged with concern. "The last thing we want is for it to break down when we need it the most." Laura, one of the engineers, looked up from her station, her face drawn with fatigue. It's running at full capacity. If we push it any further, the system could overload. Eli knew that. But the fire wasn't waiting for them to catch their breath. The real test had come, and now they had to dig deep to see if they could make it through the worst. "What about the other lines?" he asked. "How's the eastern perimeter holding up?" Vanessa quickly checked the data. "It's still holding, but the fire's moving fast. We'll need more suppressant agents to keep it under control. The teams on the ground are already stretched thin." Eli took a deep breath. He had no choice. The system could not afford to fail. Not now, not when they were so close. "Activate the backup lines," he ordered. "We'll need everything we have to keep this contained." The team scrambled into action, coordinating with the firefighting units on the ground to lay down additional lines of suppressant mist. The robotic arms of the system began to deploy in all directions, a coordinated response to the growing threat. Eli watched the progress with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The fire was still a beast, unpredictable and relentless, but the system was fighting back. They were pushing it to its limits, but for now, it was working. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the flames further into the dry brush. The fire was a living, breathing entity, and it felt as though it could sense their every move, reacting with an intensity that matched their desperation. Eli stepped outside the command center, feeling the heat of the flames even from a distance. The sky above was a canvas of orange and red, the smoke thick in the air. He could hear the distant crackling of the fire, the sound of trees and brush succumbing to the flames. But despite the overwhelming odds, despite the uncertainty, Eli stood tall. This was the moment he had been preparing for. This was his chance to prove that his invention wasn't just a theory, but a real, viable solution to the crisis of wildfires. As the fire roared on, Eli felt a surge of determination rise within him. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had come this far, and they weren't about to back down now. The real fight was only just beginning. The air was thick with smoke, and the distant crackling of the fire was like a constant drumbeat in Eli's ears. His body felt heavy, his bones sore from the endless hours of monitoring, coordinating, and strategizing. The battle against the fire had raged on for hours, but now, it was coming to a head. Eli stood in the command center, his eyes glued to the monitors, watching as the fire continued to creep closer to their last line of defense. The system had done its job, but the fire was a beast, unforgiving and relentless. His invention had held for as long as it could, but now, Eli could see the strain. The suppressant mist was being depleted faster than they could restock it, and the fire was not only consuming more ground, it was growing stronger. "Eli, we need to make a decision," Vanessa's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood next to him, her face drawn with exhaustion. "The backup lines aren't holding. The fire's moving faster than we can respond." Eli didn't need to hear it again. He could see it. The fire was pushing forward with a terrifying speed, its flames licking at the edges of their defenses. They had run out of options, and it was only a matter of time before the fire broke through. "Can we activate the next level of the system?" Eli asked, his voice tight with concern. Laura, one of the engineers, was already at her station, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "We're already operating at full capacity. Any more and the system could fail completely. If we push it, we risk everything." Eli's mind raced. He had created this system with every intention of saving lives, of stopping wildfires in their tracks. But now, the very thing he had built was teetering on the edge of collapse. They had put everything into this, every ounce of their time, their resources, their hopes, and now, they were facing the real possibility that it might not be enough. "We can't back down now," Eli said, determination flooding his veins. "We've come too far." Vanessa placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "Eli, I get it. But we're running on fumes here. The fire's going to break through, and we'll lose everything." The weight of her words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Eli had always known there were risks, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. He had gambled his entire future on this technology, and now, it felt like he was watching it slip through his fingers. "We can't fail," Eli whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. His eyes scanned the monitors one last time. The fire was still advancing, pushing ever closer to the town, to the people they had sworn to protect. The suppressant mist was the only thing standing between it and destruction. "Activate everything," Eli ordered, his voice a mixture of desperation and resolve. "Push the system to its limit. We don't have time to hesitate." Vanessa nodded, her face hardening with the same resolve. "You heard him, everyone. Do it now." The team sprang into action. The robotic arms of the suppressant system deployed with efficiency, releasing mists of suppressant at every available opening. Eli's mind was racing, watching the screens update with every deployment, every calculated measure to keep the fire at bay. But in his gut, he knew it wasn't enough. The fire had already proven that it was too powerful to be stopped by any single solution. The wind picked up, gusting through the trees with renewed fury, as if the fire itself were challenging them. Eli felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. The fire was feeding on the wind, growing faster, stronger, more uncontrollable. He could see it now: if they didn't do something drastic, the fire would be upon them within the hour. "Keep pushing the lines," Eli commanded. "We can't stop now. We have to hold." But even as he gave the orders, a small voice in the back of his mind wondered if it was too late. Had they waited too long? Had the fire grown too powerful for them to stop? The radio crackled to life, a voice cutting through the noise. "This is Fire Command 5. The eastern perimeter is down. The fire's breached. We need immediate evacuation. Repeat, we need immediate evacuation." Eli's stomach dropped. The worst had come to pass. The fire had broken through their defenses. The one thing they had been hoping to prevent, total destruction, had just happened. And now, it wasn't just a matter of saving their technology. It was a matter of saving lives. "Get the evacuation teams moving," Eli ordered. "Do whatever it takes to get people out of the path of the fire. Now." He watched as the evacuation teams mobilized, their vehicles racing toward the danger zone. Eli knew there was no way to stop the fire from spreading at this point. The best they could do was limit the damage. They needed to buy time for the people in the affected areas to escape. "We can't let this go any further," Vanessa said, her voice low with fear. "If it reaches the town." "We're not going to let it," Eli interrupted, his voice firm. He turned back to the monitors, his eyes darting between the screens. The fire was spreading faster than they could control it, but he couldn't stop fighting. Not now. Not after everything. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Eli's mind was consumed by the fire's progress, by the lives at stake. He knew that no matter what happened, this was the moment of truth. Either their technology would hold, or it wouldn't. Either they would succeed, or they would fail. And then, just as it seemed the fire might overtake everything, Eli noticed something. The suppressant mist wasn't just slowing the fire, it was pushing it back. Not by much, but enough to give them a chance. The fire was slowing. It was still there, still threatening, but the mist was working, keeping it from reaching the town. Eli's heart skipped a beat. They were holding. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had bought themselves time. It was a small victory, but it was enough. "We're not done yet," Eli said, his voice steady, even as exhaustion weighed heavily on him. "We fight until it's over." He wasn't sure how long they could keep this up, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let the fire win. Not after everything they had fought for. The fire raged in the distance, a monstrous wall of flame that threatened to swallow everything in its path. Eli stood at the edge of the command center, staring out the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with smoke, and the sky was streaked with fiery red and orange. The oppressive heat felt like it was closing in on him, but he barely noticed. His focus was singular, on the fire, and on the people he had promised to protect. Vanessa stood beside him, her face ashen, but her eyes were sharp, resolute. "Eli, it's coming. The fire's too close now." "I know," Eli replied, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding outside. "But we've bought ourselves time. The mist is still holding, and if we can get the reinforcements in place, we might just make it." The team had been working non-stop, deploying every ounce of their technology, their energy, their hope into stopping the wildfire. The suppressant system had done its job in slowing the fire, but it wasn't enough to stop it entirely. The fire had breached several lines, and now, it was racing toward the last remaining defense, the town of Everwood. Eli had one last plan, a desperate, high-risk maneuver that could either save the town or make everything worse. If he could get the additional suppressant tanks into place and get a coordinated blast across the perimeter, they might be able to create a barrier strong enough to hold the fire back. But it was a long shot. It meant risking every last resource they had, and it meant putting his entire team on the line. If it didn't work, they'd all be caught in the blaze. But Eli wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, not now. Not after everything they had endured. "We're out of time," Vanessa said, her voice tinged with fear but also determination. "We either do this now or lose everything. Are you sure about this?" Eli turned to her, his eyes steely. "We've come this far. If we don't try, then we've already lost." With that, the decision was made. The team quickly gathered, rallying behind Eli's plan. The engineers, the fire specialists, and the support staff, all of them had a role to play. They would deploy the final line of defense, one last push to prevent the fire from consuming everything they had worked for. "Activate the additional suppressant systems," Eli commanded. "We're going to need every bit of power we have left." The team moved quickly, working in tandem to get the final systems online. Tanks were refueled, the robotic arms positioned, and the last remaining drones were readied. There was no turning back now. Eli's eyes flicked between the monitors, watching as the fire drew closer, its flames licking the air like a hungry animal. "This is it," Vanessa said, her voice a mix of fear and anticipation. "You're sure this will work?" Eli nodded. "It has to." With a deep breath, he stepped forward and gave the order. "Deploy. All units. Now." The suppressant mist blasted from the tanks, a thick, foggy cloud that rolled across the land like a wave. The mist sprayed out in thick plumes, covering the perimeter of the town in a protective shroud. It wasn't enough to fully stop the fire, but it would slow it down. It would create a barrier, a chance for the people to escape. Eli watched the monitors with bated breath. For a moment, it seemed like the mist was working, pushing the flames back. The fire slowed. The lines were holding. The barrier was doing its job. But then, just as hope began to rise, the wind shifted. It was a sudden, violent gust that swept through the valley, pushing the fire in a new direction. The flames surged forward, angrier than ever, fed by the sudden change in the wind. Eli's heart sank. "Keep pushing the system," he shouted. "Full force." But the wind was relentless, the fire unstoppable. The system couldn't keep up. For every inch they gained, the fire pushed back too. "We're losing it," Laura said, her voice breaking. "The system's maxed out. It's not enough." Eli's mind raced. He couldn't afford to lose now. He had to think of something. He had to. And then it hit him. "Vanessa," Eli said urgently, "we need to push the fire back the other way. We need to use the wind against it." Vanessa's eyes widened as the realization sank in. "You mean?" "Yes," Eli said, his voice firm. "If we can create a controlled backfire, we can force the flames to turn around. It'll burn the fuel between us and the town, but we'll be able to control it. It's dangerous, but it's our last shot. Vanessa hesitated, but only for a moment. Let's do it. The team moved into action again. They would set a controlled burn to turn the fire back on itself. It was risky, and the timing had to be perfect. If they didn't get it right, they would only make things worse. Get the fuel line set up, Eli instructed, his mind working quickly. We need to set the fire on the windward side of the town. We'll use the fire's natural movement to trap it. The crew worked quickly, setting up controlled igniters along the perimeter. The fire would have to be ignited in a way that would push it back toward the approaching flames. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance they had. As the last of the fire lines were set, Eli stood on the edge of the command center, watching the approaching flames. This was it. They were about to make their stand. On my mark, Eli said, his voice steady. 3, 2, 1. The controlled fires ignited, and a wall of flame began to grow. It crept toward the approaching fire, pulling the flames toward it like a magnet. The fire met itself in the middle, and for a moment, it seemed as though everything was about to collapse in on itself. But then, something incredible happened. The fire slowed. The two flames met in a powerful, controlled clash, and instead of spreading, they pushed against each other. The fire was contained, surrounded by the suppressant mist and the backfire they had created. The temperature dropped. The winds died down. And then, for the first time in hours, the fire began to retreat. Eli let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't over yet, but they had done it. They had stopped the fire. The team erupted into cheers. For a moment, it felt like the weight of the world had lifted off their shoulders. The town was safe. They had succeeded. Against all odds, against all expectation, they had done the impossible. Eli turned to Vanessa, his face lit up with a smile. We did it. We saved them. Vanessa smiled back, relief and exhaustion in her eyes. You did it, Eli. You showed them all. The town of Everwood had survived. And Eli, the poor farmer's son, had not only saved his community, he had proven that the impossible could be done. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?